So in Unit 3, we introduced Perfect Competition, which is where you have hundreds or thousands of identical firms all producing identical products. Remember, agriculture, you can't tell the difference between the two. You don't have any outside information. So Unit 4, we get into Imperfect Competition, which refers to the remaining 3 market structures we got to look at, which are monopoly, which we'll look at first, monopolistic competition, which is just a combination of monopoly and perfect competition, and then lastly we'll look at oligopoly, which is fun to say, but there's a concept called game theory that we have to introduce, and it's a skill-based grid that you got to learn how to work through. But
clicker's not working.
Is it the what? There we go. So the point of this slide is that we've reached the point in the class where you definitely cannot memorize anymore. You have to be able to look at these graphs, read the graphs, show the changes in the graph, draw the graph, everything with the graph. You cannot memorize it. It's like a math class. If you try to memorize it, it's just not going to work on the test. You can't. It's not like a traditional history at this point. You've got to be able to work in and out of these graphs. So know that going forward. All right. So the remaining 3 market structures on the right, every business in the world, in the United States, whatever economic structure you're looking at, belongs in one of these 4 categories. Ultimately, it is dependent on the number of producers and the barriers to entry more than anything, meaning how hard is it to enter and exit into this firm. Types of barriers to entry, and I think we touched on these a little bit, but high fixed or startup cost. If you take a company such as SpaceX, which is really mostly a monopoly right now, you're starting to see some competition, but to create a company such as SpaceX from the ground up, we're looking at unintended astronomical cost. Yeah, get it? But that's the point, is that the cost to start a business such as that are so high, that's going to exclude new competition, because 99.9% of people do not have the funds available to start a competing business even if they want to. Geography or ownership of raw materials just means that you either control all the raw materials needed for production. For a long time, diamonds were this way. That there was a company called De Beers that controlled like over 90% of diamond mines. Well, if they have control of all those resources, well, no one else can produce those finished products. So that is a ownership of raw materials, or geography a lot of times prevents competition. Any kind of major league sports franchise typically has geographical barriers to entry, meaning unless you are LA or New York, a lot of times the market just doesn't support 2 competing businesses, meaning you can't have 2 competing sports teams in the same market because then they're both going to fail. There's not a big enough fan base or customer base if you look at it. Part of the reason that we've seen Birmingham have a hard time over and over and over again bringing in these mid-level sports franchises is that the fan base here just really isn't big enough to support a lot of those franchises. Whereas, you take in Atlanta or you create a bigger geographical zone. If you look at, the reason they named it Tennessee Titans instead of the Nashville Titans, it creates a bigger geological area to recruit more people in. And so it's kind of interesting if you look at the business structures of those big sports franchises of how they actually fit into these market structures. But basically they're all franchises. If you got enough money, you can buy one. But once again, that high cost excludes a lot of people. Not everyone can afford to own a pro sports team.
So basically, like the owner, like you just come up and go, hey, here's $400 million, take it.
Yeah, that's why when if you watch pro sports, they'll show, this is the owner of such and such team. It's a franchise of someone actually else. Now they hire managers, they hire coaches, and obviously they hire players, but someone actually owns that franchise.
And so when this owner guys passes away, who takes over for that? Someone else has to buy it from them? Or?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, typically it would go to market. Whoever wants to buy it can buy it. So, or the league, whatever league they're in, is going to have some say so as a franchise part of that league. So, but that's the reason you see sports teams move markets too. I mean, that's why the Raiders and the Rams and all that have bounced around, because that's a franchise that someone owns and they decided to move cities. So it's not owned by the city that it was originally started in. Atlanta doesn't necessarily own
the Braves.
The
Braves own the Braves.
Yeah, there's whoever the individual is that owns them owns that franchise. So, anyways, stepping aside from the fun, interesting things to talk about, let's move forward with graphing imperfect competition. All right, the big thing with graphing imperfect competition that's going to be different than we've already seen is all right guys, bear with me so we can get through this. I'm not going to talk over everyone. Imperfect competition, you had that horizontal Mr. Dark curve. That was marginal revenue, demand, average revenue, and price. The big difference with imperfect competition is you now have downward sloping demand and marginal revenue curves that are no longer the same. Price and marginal revenue are no longer the same because of this. And so that nice, convenient Mr. Dark curve has now separated into multiple curves. We're going to look at why, but that's the biggest change, is that instead of one curve, you now have multiple curves. And you have a traditional downward sloping demand curve, which is going to be above a downward sloping marginal revenue curve. Reason being, firms have to lower their price in order to attract new customers. This kind of gets back into elastic and inelastic demand that we talked about in Unit 2. But in order to attract new customers, they're going to have to lower that price. Because remember, the law of demand that we talked about, like the first thing out of the gate in Unit 2, that as price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. That law is still present here in these market structures. So, if the price is $10, the quantity demanded is 1, which means the total revenue, price times quantity, gives you 10. The marginal revenue for that first unit is 10. In order to sell a second unit, or in order to increase the quantity being demanded, they had to lower that price. So they go from $10 to $9. Quantity demanded goes from 1 to 2. Total revenue goes from 10 to 18. That's the key thing here, because if they sold one unit for $10, the total revenue is 10. If they sold 2 units for $9, the total revenue is 18. So the additional revenue from selling that second unit was only $8. They sold it for $9, but the marginal revenue, which is the change in the total revenue, was only 8.
Where did 8 come from?
The difference between 10 and 18 in total revenue.
Oh, okay.
So remember, marginal revenue is typically the change in total revenue.
So does that mean the business is like unsuccessful?
No. Because they just generated more money. They went from bringing in $10, now they brought in $18. So they're bringing in more revenue. Well, we can't really base the success of the business yet because we don't know their cost. Now, once we throw all this in with the cost curves, then yeah, we can make all these determinations. But right now we're just looking at the concept that in order to attract new business, they're going to have to lower that price. And when they do, it's going to affect the total revenue and the marginal revenue. So let's keep going. In order to attract that third person, quantity demanded of 3, they lowered the price to $8. Total revenue is 24, which is 8 times 3. So they sell 3 units at $8 a piece. The total revenue, the amount of money they bring in, is $24. The change in total revenue was 6, the difference between 18 and 24. So they sold it for $8, but they only brought in an additional $6 in total revenue. If you continue down, this trend continues. $7, total revenue of 28, marginal revenue of 4. So what we're seeing right now, there's an increase in total revenue, but you see marginal revenue is diminishing, which is going to give it that downward sloping curve. But continue to go. Eventually, total revenue is going to decrease. Marginal revenue is going to go negative. Now, we've seen marginal revenue go negative before, but in this case, it's going to cross the x-axis when we start to graph it. We're going to talk about the elastic and inelastic range too. That as long as marginal revenue stays positive, they're going to be in the elastic range. Once it goes negative, they're in the inelastic range, which means they're not going to produce there because they're losing money. Meaning, if they sold that 7th unit for $4, they're actually losing money by doing that, which makes no sense. No business is ever going to do that. So, because of that concept that they have to lower the price to attract new customers, and it's going to affect the total revenue and marginal revenue. This is what your marginal revenue and your demand curves are going to look like for the 3 remaining market structures, which we term imperfect competition. Same thing once again, they've got to lower the price in order to see an increase in the quantity demanded. That's that law of demand right there. That's that inverse relationship you saw in Unit 2. That is, the price goes down from $6 to $1, the quantity demanded is going to increase from 0 to 5. That's that inverse relationship you've seen over and over again. Total revenue goes up from 0 to 9 and then starts to decrease, and then marginal revenue is going to diminish and then eventually go negative. Now, we know the goal of a business is not to maximize revenue, but somewhere in this range is going to be that profit maximizing output. We have to have the total cost. Actually, we got to have the marginal cost. Remember, marginal revenue equal to marginal cost that we talked about before Thanksgiving is the profit maximizing output. Well, that's going to be somewhere in this range because they're not going to produce when it goes negative. But we don't know what that point is yet without knowing that marginal cost. So usually this is a multiple choice question on the test. Sometimes maybe it's come up in an FRQ, but it wants you to know that a monopoly is only going to produce in what we call the elastic range, which is where marginal revenue hasn't gone negative yet. You can base this on total revenue test, which remember is the easiest way to determine elastic versus inelastic if you don't have to calculate the coefficient. It was just the price and the quantity before the change, and then the price and the quantity after the change. That if the price goes up and the total revenue goes up, then it's inelastic. Here, if we lower the price and total revenue, where is it? Well, this is going to be the last slide, but this red curve is your total revenue. That blue one is marginal revenue. The labeling is weird here, but as long as marginal revenue has yet to go negative, it's diminishing, it's getting smaller, but as that price goes down, that total revenue is increasing. Once marginal revenue goes negative and crosses the x-axis, and we see it go negative here, that's when the total revenue for the firm starts to go down. Once the firm starts losing revenue, they're not going to produce at that point, because that means for each new unit they produce, they're losing money. Here, they're at least generating more revenue, or at least bringing in a greater total revenue. And like I said, we can't determine profit maximizing output because we don't know the cost yet. But in a general sense, a firm's only going to produce as long as total revenue is increasing. If they hit that point and it costs more to produce it, or we're going to see a loss in revenue, the firm's not going to produce it. Does that make sense? They're not going to produce anything they're going to lose money on. That's the point of the story.